Okay. We'll get this top hat stuff straightened out. But for the most part, this is the beginning where it starts to count now. Okay. We kind of looked at this earlier. I just want to make sure that we kind of understand things. First of all, a population. Populations evolve. Individuals don't evolve. In other words, during my life, I don't evolve. I'm as shallow as I ever was. Okay? All I care about is how I look, how many dates I go on. Nothing has changed at all, whatsoever, except for the fact that I used to be 6'2", blonde hair and blue eyes. But that was just drugs. Now, so populations evolve, individuals do not. Selection acts on individuals. In other words, some individuals have traits that are beneficial and lead to higher reproductive success than other traits or trait variants. It's not like, it'd be better if I had this trait, I guess I better evolve it. It doesn't work that way. If it worked that way, I would be flying right now. I'd have wings and I'd fly. I'd like to fly. But I can't. I'm born with what I got, and that's what I'm bringing to the table. It's kind of like a poker game, which I played this weekend, by the way, and I did win a lot. It was good. Well, a lot if it's nickel time and quarter. But anyway, your hands are your hands. The hand you dealt is the hand you dealt. It's not like you can say, I wish I had a better hand. Well, yeah, you do, but you can't suddenly change your hand. No organism can actually do that. Well, a few can, but forget about those for the time being. Okay, then the gene pool. Now, a population is a group of individuals of the same species. Okay. So here's our population. Okay, and we can see in terms of genotype frequencies, these are heterozygotes. There's two alleles. What's an allele, anybody? A variant of a gene, exactly. And since we're diploid, we each have two alleles. Sometimes they're the same allele, as in the blue chickens, they're A1, A1, or the orange chickens, A2, A2. Sometimes they're different, as in A1, A2. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have thousands of different alleles, but for each individual, they're only going to have two out of those possible alleles. Some alleles are just fixed. There's no variation whatsoever in the population. So, if you took all the alleles in the population, each individual is donating two, you'd end up with a gene pool. Those are all the genes, all the alleles from the whole population. So let's say you had a population of 100 chickens. You would end up with a gene pool of 200 alleles. You understand that? You not understand that? In other words, remember, each individual has two alleles, because we're diploid, and so if there's 100 individuals in the population, you actually have 200 alleles in the whole gene pool. And the gene pool is right there in the center. In this case, you actually either have a blue allele or an orange allele. And then in terms of genotype, you have three genotypes. This is a very simple model. And the greens are the ones where you mix orange and blue together and you get green. That means they're heterozygotes. The other ones are homozygotes. Okay, so we want to, when we're looking at population, we're actually pulling alleles in terms of mating from this whole gene pool. And so we know what an allele is. A genotype is the actual alleles that an individual has. In this case, you either have one of two alleles. Either they're both the same allele, whether they're blue-blue, A1, or A2, or you might have a mix. 1A1 from your mama, 1A2 from your papa. Now, so that's the alleles, the gene variants that you actually have. Remember, alleles or genes do not code for traits. They code for proteins. The proteins are the traits. So a phenotype, a little bit different, is the actual expression of those genes. So in terms of anatomy, physiology, how the organism develops, the behavior of the individual. And this is, the phenotype is actually what selection, natural selection, actually works on. It may correspond very closely to a genotype. Let's say you have a genotype that codes for a pigment that's light blue in terms of a protein. You'll have light blue eyes. And then we'll get to this a little bit later, but genes, the phenotype is also an expression not only of the alleles that you have, but how they interact with the environment that they're in. So here we are again. The essence of the process of evolution is that new heritable variants, these are mutations, are constantly entering the populations through reproduction, while other variants are leaving through death. Now, some alleles are, have no effect, but some alleles might be beneficial, some alleles might be bad for you. So in this kind of a situation, you would expect that eventually the individuals with lousy alleles would leave fewer offspring, and the population would have few individuals with those actual alleles anymore. And whereas from mutation, beneficial alleles would gradually build up in the population. So this is what's called microevolution. Okay. Now, we've talked mainly about evolution by natural selection and how evolution by natural selection results in adaptation. And that adaptation is a set of alleles or traits that benefits an individual in terms of survival and reproduction. So there's something called evolutionary fitness, which is survival and reproduction. But as I mentioned earlier, you can have an individual, let's say you have a bad boy, and he has sex with lots of women. He doesn't care if they already have boyfriends. And so let's say he fathers 40 offspring. Well, when he tries to father the 41st, he's caught by the girlfriend's boyfriend, and he shoots the guy. So instead of the guy living, surviving until old age, he's dead at 22, let's say. Now you might say, well, he has low fitness. But if you actually look at it, he's got high fitness. He's got 40 kids that he already fathered. And if you're lucky or unlucky, however way you want to look at it, you know, you might have 2 or 3 or 5 kids. kids, by the way, are usually the cause of divorce. I just want you to know that. You guys think your parents love you? Oh, God, you have no idea. They say they love you. They're taught to love you, but they all the stress that you put them through. That's right. What you put your parents through stress?
Me?
Who said that? Who laughed? Okay. What do you do that drives them crazy?
I should tell me to do something and I just don't do it stuff.
They say, yeah. Could you go to work and make some money? And you say, no. Oh, you already do that.
My chores, like walking, clean this.
Yeah, clean that. I hate cleaning.
Yeah, so
Why don't you just hire someone to do it, right? Yeah. Weeding. Why don't you just go get a gardener and do it? Yeah, right. No, chores, right. There's other things you do too that we won't even talk about that really make your parents crazy. Okay, so we talked primarily about natural selection, but we're going to get more into it. The thing is, I just want you to know that populations evolve not just because of evolution by natural selection. Mutations arise from copying errors, and those mutations, most of them are probably either have no effect or are bad. And if they have very little effect, they might kind of stay in the population. If they're bad, they usually get thrown out. So mutation is another force. You can have just mutation, forget about natural selection, whether it's a good or bad allele. Mutation is another force that will change the frequency of alleles in a population. You remember that's one of the definitions. Frequency means how common or how rare it is. Okay. There's another force called genetic drift. It's a completely random effect. If I were to walk along without watching, and a butterfly is actually on the ground drinking water from a puddle, and I step on it, it's dead. Now, you could say, well, that's selection, except that it is, except that it's random, because the butterfly is really not going to have any traits that are going to actually protect it or make it more likely to survive. And so that's a random effect. As another random effect, since we have two alleles, each of us have two alleles, there's a 50% chance, like flipping a coin, whether we get an allele from our father or an allele from our mother. So let's say the alleles are A1 and A2, and there's a chance, just in terms of, since we have two alleles, in terms of our own offspring, we can either donate, in terms of our sperm or eggs, A1, blue allele, A2, orange allele. So genetic drift is something that is a random sort of event, like flipping a coin. It's not adaptive. It could be good, it could be bad, it could have no effect. We'll get into it more later, but drift, a population with few individuals has more genetic drift going on than a large population. Non-random mating is another force that will change allele frequencies from one generation to the next. And then migration, or gene flow, from one individual from out of the population into the population, or an individual going out of the population into another population. That's gene flow. And individuals who mate, that means there's gene flow going on if you're producing an offspring or not. But in general, if you have a closed population, gene flow can usually bring in new alleles that the population doesn't have already. So, in terms of evolution, remember, one of the definitions in terms of microevolution is that there's a change in the allele frequencies in a population over time. Okay. Darwin. Now, Darwin had two great ideas. Do you guys remember what they were? Huh?
Darwinism?
Okay, Darwin. Well, what exactly is Darwinism? Okay, evolution by natural selection. That's one of them. And what's the other great idea? Who do you come from? Ancestors, right? Your parents, grandparents, right? So, the other part of, yeah.
It's that animals come from common ancestors.
Exactly. So common ancestry is the other big idea. We're going to start out with evolution by natural selection. And evolution by natural selection is the only force that can actually lead to adaptive evolution. That means increasing the fitness of the whole population. Okay. Now, Darwin, where did Darwin get his great idea? As you know, he went on the Beagle, which was a British research ship that went around the world over a 5-year period. He was a naturalist. He collected stuff. He was originally going to be a vicar, and then he stopped deciding to become a vicar, which is like a priest. He was rich, came from a family with wealth, so he didn't have to work. So one of the things that wealthy people did was they bred things. And then they'd show their friends what they had bred. These are pigeons, and if you actually look at them, you see some pretty wild birds. On the left is a fantail. There's a whole bunch of different ones. There was even a pigeon that's bred that would be flying along, and it was called a tumbler. And it would suddenly kind of shut down. Its nervous system would start to tumble and then wake up again and start flying. So all these things were bred. That means selective breeding by people. Now, we do selective breeding all the time, not just for animals, but for plants as well, for bacteria, all kinds of things. We want certain breeds to have certain traits. So in terms of, if we look at corn, up in the middle up there, now, okay. The original corn, hold on a second. Was called teosinte. This is what it looked like. Doesn't look like much of a corn. It's very small kernels. But it was first bred as a food source in central Mexico about 10,000 years ago. And there's variation, if you remember, among corn, among plants, and some plants had bigger kernels than others. And over time, the people who were breeding or growing this food, growing this corn for food, well, what they did was they wouldn't plant the seeds of a corn that were only had kernels like this. They were more likely to plant the seeds of a corn that were bigger, right? Bigger kernels. And over time, many, many, many generations, eventually you ended up with this large stalk of corn with really large kernels. That's called artificial selection. Same thing with dogs. People have bred dogs for all sorts of different reasons. Some just because, you know, like little lap dogs. Others to actually do work. And we did the same thing in terms of animal husbandry, in terms of food animals, animals that we want to eat. So we have a cow here. The original ancestor was called an oryx. It was not a dumb cow like we see cows today. It was pretty smart, and it was big, and it was fierce. Somehow they managed to tame it. A pig, same thing. Sheep, goats, number of chickens, all sorts of things. And each time, in terms of breeding, sometimes people consciously did it, mostly it was unconscious. Oh, I like this animal, so I think I'll breed this individual with this individual because it's got these traits that I like. So that's artificial selection, that's selective breeding. Well, Darwin saw this and did a lot of this himself. And he realized that there could be the same sort of process going on in nature, except that an individual selecting either consciously or unconsciously for a certain trait, it was nature, the environment that the organism was in. So let's say the organism is a wolf, and it's got this coat that keeps it warm when it's cold out, very dense coat. Now, let's say the weather, the selective force, decided, well, the weather got colder, didn't decide anything, it just happened, or warmer, like global warming. So it got colder. Now, individuals with a thicker coat would probably stay warmer, have better condition, perhaps leave more offspring than some individual who had a very thin coat and was shivering all the time. And so what you'd expect is that eventually the coat of the wolf, when the climate got colder, would get thicker. No one was actually selecting for a thicker coat. The environment was. But Darwin decided to call it natural selection, or the struggle for existence. So we first got the idea from selective breeding. So what is natural selection? Anybody? How about you? What's natural selection? Can you give an example? What? Oh, yeah, I know, because you're a little shy. Listen, there's all these people around you. They're idiots. Okay, they don't count. It's just you and me talking here. So, let's think about what might be an example of natural selection. 1 second. You have a gazelle. It's an animal like an antelope. It can run really fast. What eats gazelles? do you think? Cheetahs. Cheetahs eat gazelles. So cheetahs, that's the natural world. Really fast cheetahs eat more gazelles than really slow cheetahs. Okay? So cheetahs are imposing selection. They're not doing it consciously, they just want to eat on these gazelles. And the gazelles that have traits already that make them faster compared to other gazelles that are slower, so those individuals escape more often and leave and breed more often and leave more offspring in the future generations, and so eventually over time, population of gazelle gets faster and faster and faster. And the gazelles are actually imposing selection on the cheetahs. Yeah.
I was thinking like a population of giraffes where like some of them have short necks and they can't reach the branches, so they die off, and you only have a population of giraffes with long necks.
Longer necks.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not like during your lifetime with Lamarckian evolution that, oh, I'm a giraffe, and if I keep stretching, I'll get a longer and longer neck. You either have a longer neck, a medium-sized neck, whatever, and you pass those traits, that next length, onto your offspring. If you're unfortunate and you're a giraffe with a short neck, it's a lot unlikely that your offspring, you're going to have many offspring, because you're probably going to starve to death while other giraffes with longer necks can reach the upper leaves. Okay. So I say natural selection is probably an unfortunate choice of words. It kind of implies that something or someone is selecting, and that is not what is happening. Nature, or the environment that the organism finds itself in, is the selective force. Those individuals that have traits that allow that individual in that environment to survive and reproduce better than others are the ones that have higher fitness and lead more offspring and contribute more to the gene pool of future populations, while the other ones kind of die out. Okay. So, is evolution by natural selection different than natural selection? What's evolution? What's the definition of evolution? Huh? Okay, what's a evolution? What evolves? Individuals or populations? Populations, right? Okay, selection happens on individuals. So populations evolve over time. One of the forces that causes that evolution in the population to happen is natural selection. That's the actual mechanism. And so evolution by natural selection means that the populations are evolving because of natural selection favoring some variants compared to others. Is it possible to have natural selection without evolution? Just think about the case where something happens and it would have no real effect on the population whatsoever. It would have no effect. The individual might, let's say, die, but it's not like the individual has a trait that would help it survive that sort of calamity. Like me walking along and accidentally stepping on a butterfly. Is it possible to have evolution without natural selection? Well, I mentioned, what are some of the other forces of evolution, anybody? Genetic drift. Okay, that's a random event. Populations evolve randomly in terms of allele frequencies. Forget about whether the alleles are good or bad, just randomly from genetic drift. So you can have both. You can have natural selection without evolution actually happening, and you can also have evolution happening without natural selection, but some other force of evolution. Okay? So the difference is that evolution by natural selection is caused by a force in the environment, some environmental variable. In this case, with the wolves, let's say the climate got colder, and eventually, all the wolves eventually had thicker coats. The ones that were born with thinner coats didn't survive and reproduce as well. So here's some, a lot of words here, but basically, any consistent, evolution by natural selection. Any consistent difference in survival and reproduction, in other words, fitness, among genotypically or phenotypically different classes of organisms within a population, that says a lot. Genotype. Remember we talked about genotype, having which alleles that you inherited from your parents, or phenotype, those alleles coded for certain proteins that gave you the traits that you have. Now, natural selection is the modifying force or the mechanism that kind of sorts traits in terms of who gets to breed and reproduce and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you've ever taken a sieve with different size holes in it. Let's say it's a sieve with big holes, and some of the larger pebbles get through, the really large ones don't. The stuff with, like, you know, the sand, they all get through. And so the only thing left on top are particles, pebbles that are larger than a certain size. You can also have a sieve that actually sorts for very small things. So everything gets through except for clay particles, which are the finest. Having those traits, let's say in terms of pebble size or, you know, grain size like in sand, or really small size like in clay, those particles, well, they weren't born that way, they just are that way. It's not like they can decide, oh, I'd rather be, a clay particle might say, I'd rather be a big rock. Well, millions of years earlier, it probably was part of a big rock that got ground down. So, natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently favors, that produces adaptations. An adaptation is strictly a trait that benefits the animal or the organism in that specific environment. There is no perfect adaptation. We looked at the wolves, right? What would happen if you had all these wolves and then there was suddenly, over a long period of time, warming, and the temperature, average temperature, eventually got warmer and warmer and warmer? Would wolves with a thin coat or a thick coat have higher fitness? Thin coat, right? Now remember, before, when it was cold, having a thick coat was adaptive. Now it's maladaptive. And since there's already variation, even though the mean thick coatness might have changed to higher density of fur, there will still be some individuals with less dense fur. They'll breed more successfully, and their offspring, there will still be variation, and the ones that have the least dense fur will actually be more successful in a warmer climate. Okay. Adaptation is any trait that increases individual fitness. That means survival and reproduction in a specific environment. And fitness is just that, the ability to survive and reproduce. So you want to think in terms of fitness, how much is the individual organism contributing genes or alleles to the next generation and traits to the next generation? a high fitness individual leaves more offspring than a low fitness individual. Okay, there's some other things that I want you to realize. Okay, selection works on individuals. It's not like the cheetah is feeding on the whole population. It's feeding individually on each cheetah. The cheetahs that are, the gazelles that are slow are the ones that are feeding on. The gazelles that are fast are the ones that are escaping, and those individuals are going to probably be more successful in obviously surviving long enough to reproduce. And future generations will have inherited alleles that lead to offspring that can run faster and faster and faster. And the same thing, this is called coevolution. So the cheetah is a selective force causing evolution in the gazelle population. And the gazelle population, individuals that run faster, mean certain cheetahs who go after the fastest individuals, individual cheetahs who are slower are probably not going to leave as many offspring as cheetahs who are faster. So it selects for faster and faster and faster cheetahs. Okay. Now, populations, on the other hand, do change. They evolve. They're made up of individuals who have certain traits. In this case, that they probably inherited from their parents and grandparents and all that, that make it more likely that they're going to survive and reproduce. And they make up future generations of the population. The slower gazelles and their traits have been weeded out. Only those gazelles, the swiftest gazelles, are the ones contributing. Okay. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection? What do you think? A lion, you're out in the Serengeti, you think lions are cute, you walk up to one to pet the nice little kitty, what happens? It eats you, okay? Is that selection? Why? If a stupid gazelle did the same thing, would that be selection? By the lion on the gazelle. Natural selection. Yeah. So what's the difference between you and a gazelle? Except the gazelle can run a hell of a lot faster than you. I know you probably want to run really fast if you got into that situation and realized the lion was going to eat you. It wouldn't matter. Okay. Are you an animal or not? Okay, you're a mammal, and mammals are a class of animals. Okay, so if you're an animal and a mammal, why would it be any different for the lion eating the gazelle compared to a lion eating you? It is natural selection. Good. You see, this is a good question and a good answer. Your initial answer was maybe not, because it was like, oh, humans. But you see, we're just animals. I'm a real animal. Okay. Now, if you get the girl and I don't, unlikely, but it could happen. Is that natural selection? Yes. In other words, it has nothing to do with survival. It has to do with the fact that I get the girl and we have sex and we produce offspring. So if I get more girls than you, my fitness is higher. Or if girls, they decide, well, this guy's, he's a nice guy. he's really attentive, but he doesn't really thrill me. So I'll go out and have sex with a whole bunch of other guys that I think thrill me. I'll get pregnant by one of them, and then I'll get this poor schlub to help me raise a kid. Okay? Happens both ways. Okay. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? Yeah. This is all natural selection. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to result in evolution by natural selection, but it's certainly natural selection. Even whether the person doing the bopping is aware that he wants to kill you, it's a real active choice, or it just happened. If a pine cone hits you on the head, is that natural selection? Yes. It doesn't mean you're going to end up with evolution by natural selection. How can you be, what trait would make it less likely that you would have a dented cranium and die after getting hit on the head by a pine cone? Yeah. So, perhaps the pine cone falling down, eventually, some people there's natural variation in the skull thickness. Those people would leave, if they're getting hit on the head by pine cones all the time, they're likely to leave more offspring than some thin-headed individual who gets hit on the head by a pine cone. Of course, there might be some other, still the same selective force, but some other trait that protects you from pine cones. In other words, you might learn that, oh, smart individuals, they don't go into the forest because pine cones are hitting people on the head all the time. They decide, I'm going to stay out of the forest. They're going to leave more offspring. In this case, it's adaptive. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? Yeah? No? Anybody?
Yes.
I heard both. Okay. The pine cone. The pine cone, we say, oh, it's natural. The bus, not so much, right? But it's still a selective force. Now, the same thing might happen with a pine cone. Some individuals, really big individuals, might get hit by buses and survive. In fact, it might become a sport with them. Kind of show off, right? And then over time, those individuals with thick skins and big bones leave more offspring until finally they have skin that's almost like a bony plate to protect them from, bus impacts. Or, similarly, some people might realize, if I stay out of the road, I'm less likely to get hit by a bus. There's variation in cognitive function. Those individuals might. So that could be evolution by natural selection. It doesn't matter what the selective force is. Selective force is life, basically, or the environment, everything around you. Some parts of the selective environment are stronger than others. So which of the previous might result in evolution by natural selection? The lion eats you?
Yes.
Okay, and what would the individuals who survive, what would their offspring be like?
Very quick.
Quick or smart? Like, don't walk up to a lion and pet the nice kitty. If you get the girl and I don't, is that selection? No?
Yeah.
Yes? Yeah. It's like you're born and you're a cute guy or a cute girl. You won the lottery, right? If I bop you on the head and kill you, could that end up being evolution by natural selection? Who's likely to win a fight? A big guy or a small guy? Is size heritable? I mean, can you inherit size from your parent? Are individuals more likely to be tall if their parents were tall? Okay. If a pine cone hits you on the head, that's natural selection? Could you probably evolve? Well, unlikely. But it could happen. The same thing with a bus, just more discerning about your environment. Okay. So, for natural selection to actually work, evolution by natural selection, not just natural selection, among the population of individuals, you have to have variation. If all individuals were, let's say, a clone of you, everybody in the class was you. Everybody, identical to you. There would be no variation. So even if a cheetah or a lion ate you, it really wouldn't affect the whole population because for the most part everybody's you. So you need variation. We talked about typological thinking in the past about perfection. You know, the Creator created things that were perfect, and then it's only in the world where things are imperfect that you have imperfection. Well, imperfection is actually variation. And variation, in other words, having certain kinds of traits versus others, doesn't necessarily mean that you're a loser. You're only a loser or a winner in a certain environment. That environment can change. Salute. Natural selection. Each generation, more individuals survive and reproduce more successfully than others. That's just what happens. It's something we see. And selection works on individuals. In other words, those individuals with traits that help them survive and reproduce. And they have traits that are heritable, that they can pass on to their offspring. Those will have higher fitness and leave more offspring, and their traits will be passed on to future generations. So natural selection by evolution, or evolution by natural selection, is that. That is the only way you can actually end up with an adaptation where, like the wolf, over time, individuals are better adapted to their environment. And then eventually, evolution by natural selection gradually transforms populations. Populations evolve over time, mainly because future populations are filled with descendants of those who had traits that helped them survive and reproduce more successfully. So here we are with variation. All these guys down here are short, but there is one variant up here whose head is sticking out. Who's it going to be? Inheritance. In other words, being short or tall, is it heritable? Can you pass it along? Not everything is heritable. In this case, the selection is this fellow, this farmer with an axe. And they chop someone's head off. Individuals that don't get their heads chopped off, they breed and leave more offspring, even if eventually they get their heads chopped off. Who's going to get their head chopped off here? The long one. I know it's nice that bigger is better, right? Not in this case, right? In this case, the long one's going to lose its head. It's unfortunate. It's going to have lower fitness. In fact, eventually, most of the population is just going to be short. And then, well, unfortunately, people are they're going to lose their heads anyway. It's just a natural selection. It's kind of like life. It grinds people down, right? Till they finally get old and die. Some people get ground down faster than others. All the differences. So here's adaptation. This is a snake. Can you guys see it? hard to see. Why? Camouflage. So, in fact, this is a pit viper with venom. It blends in with the leaves, and so a mouse might be hopping along unsuspectingly, doesn't see it, and it gets eaten. Or a mouse, there's mice with different colors, like mice that are tan versus mice that are black. If you have an environment where there's a lot of lava that's dark lava, if you're a mouse with a black coat, you're more likely to survive because you'll be camouflaged. Same thing with the polar bears, except that they're camouflaged, so that's good when they're hunting, but also, it turns out, having white coat is beneficial in a really cold environment. Same thing with the giraffes. In this case, selection is on food, resources, and those with longer necks actually get a meal when all the other leaves are gone. And then you have more camouflage. You have these insects that look like a leaf, so that when a bird comes along, it thinks it's a leaf and not an insect. Same kind of insect, except that this one looks like a dead leaf. These are all adaptations. So, in terms of the overview, evolution by natural selection occurs when random mutation creates heritable genetic variation that can be passed on from parent to offspring. Mutations are random with respect to fitness. In other words, some mutations are beneficial. Some mutations are deleterious or bad. Some mutations are not in a coding region and they don't have any effect. Yes?
Is there any mutation that has happened to the human race that we have evolved to?
Oh yeah,
Like,
sure. Being able to drink milk, lactose tolerance. A lot of populations of humans don't because they never had pastoral dairying culture. And even so, there was, in fact, lactose intolerance has evolved at least 3 times independently in different populations. Not with the lactase gene, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, but it's the control region upstream, and there's been mutations there, but they were different mutations that kept the lactase gene producing lactase. Okay. Most mutations have no effects, or actually they lower fitness. In fact, if you think about it, if mutations change the, there's a change in the genetic code, and a different protein is made, it's more likely that protein will be not as good as the protein that was before. Okay? In fact, it might be completely non-functional. So most mutations have bad effects compared to beneficial effects. Some individuals have adaptive alleles, trait variants that confer higher fitness. And then in terms of mutations, when individuals, they produce gametes, right? Well, sometimes there's something gets substituted. One of the 4 letters of the genetic code gets substituted for another one, and you end up with a mutant variety. Darwin knew that natural selection worked on variation in traits. In other words, there has to be variation. And he knew that there had to be some sort of inheritance, but he didn't know what it was. At that time, it was thought that there was something called blending inheritance, like you take red paint and white paint and you mix them together, you get pink. And that this kind of inheritance would eventually kind of wash out any variant that actually had higher fitness. He didn't know about particulate inheritance, which was discovered around the same time by Mendel, but it was not published in a journal that Darwin read. And so he had no way of knowing about particular inheritance. He didn't know exactly. He assumed that there had to be variation, and he didn't know how variation happened or why it happened. He didn't know inheritance, and he also didn't know anything about gene regulation as well.